Media at McGill is a hub of research, scholarship, and public outreach on issues and controversies in media, technology, and culture. Visit us online at media.mcgill.ca.
On the various conflicts that you talked about in emerging superpowers and democracies like India, China, and Brazil.
Well, India, China, and Brazil, are three very different countries. In Brazil, the media is largely owned by corporations. In India, you used to have an incredibly strong and powerful print media, but they've been very trivialized. They've copied and mimicked the newspapers in the West, by and large, the worst newspapers, in my opinion. There's one serious newspaper left in India, the Hindu, produced in Madras, whose quality of reporting still is excellent. India's numerous television networks, by and large, produce dross, in my opinion, which is a big tragedy. You didn't mention Pakistan, which is India's neighbor, but interestingly enough, the emergence of a whole network of private channels in Pakistan, till recently when the government intervened forcefully, and I mean with bullets, to stop them, or some of them, these channels were putting out quite incredible news bulletins. I was just totally touched, actually, and moved when I was in Pakistan earlier in April this year, to see how the private channels were reporting the campaign for an independent judiciary. It was daily reporting. Talking to people on the streets, talking to lawyers, talking to the judges, who were all out onto the streets because the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court had been dismissed by General Musharraf. And the media reporting was excellent, and I was amazed. And they were mainly young people in their 20s, under 30, doing reporting, questioning politicians, questioning people, doing vox pops on the streets. And what had triggered that off was that they had been excited by a big movement that had erupted, for a constitutional struggle on the separation of powers. They had never seen that in Pakistan before, that this was a struggle for an independent judiciary. It had nothing to do with religion, nothing to do with money, nothing to do with corruption. And that excited the journalists, so they reported it. And that was quite interesting. China, the media is heavily controlled. And one of the leading Chinese magazines, Du Shu, which was a New Left type journal, which used to report on strikes, on peasant uprisings, on the condition of workers in this country, that is just, the editor was removed and the government has more or less taken it over. So the Chinese regime is very tough-minded on these questions and not a good model at all, I'm afraid. We can't look there for hope. Okay.
Hello. I was wondering what role do you feel audio media plays today, like radio? And could you give suggestions for people who are looking for alternative English news media sources for where they could turn besides Democracy Now? I know you mentioned that one.
An alternative news media here?
Some that you've heard of. I know some, but maybe you know different ones.
Well, an alternative news media emerges when people feel the need for it. And so lots of stuff you see on the internet now reflects that. The problem is that there's a lot of rubbish on the internet too. And so, people learn to trust some websites and not others. But I give you one example. The whole number of indie media groups which erupted in the early years after Seattle did some incredible work. One concrete example was when the Americans occupied Baghdad, the big image of the statue of Saddam Hussein being pulled down. The way that was filmed by most of the Western media outfits was to pretend that this was another version of the Berlin Wall. That's what they had in mind. Well, the Berlin Wall wasn't faked. People genuinely wanted to break it down. In Iraq, they couldn't find too many people. So the 20 Iraqis who they found to pose had been brought by Ahmed Chalabi on a plane. Most of them had lived outside. The native population of Baghdad didn't like Saddam Hussein, but they didn't like this fake media event in euphoria. And finally, American Marines went in with big things and brought the statue down. But the way that image was shot was to try and create the impression that this was a mass event, which it wasn't. And an indie media reporter with an ordinary DV camera showed the event as it was, a tiny group of people collected around the statue in an empty square. And that went round the web, and that had a mega impact. And I remember on the first anniversary of this event, I was on some British television show, and they showed it again, and I said, "You're shameless. We all know this was a complete fake. So why are you showing this again?" And the guy got very embarrassed and, sort of moved me on hurriedly to another question. So it's, that's how alternatives emerge, is when a group of journalists get together and decide to do things like that. And the indie media coverage often is good, so, there is hope. Yeah.
You talked about what's going in Iraq not has been recognized as a genocide. Can you relate this to the Armenian genocide not has been recognized by the America and Israel?
The Armenian genocide you're talking about?
Yes.
Look, the point I was making was very simple, that the word genocide can get debased if you apply it to every single thing. And in my opinion, there have been genocides. Obviously, the murder of 6 million Jews by the Third Reich was a horrific genocidal act against the Jewish people of Europe, carried out by the Germans and their collaborators in France, by the way, and collaborators in Italy. Very little, recently a big book was published about the French collaborators, but anyway, so that was a genocide. The Armenian genocide, widely accepted now. It's not a big, the Turkish government will not accept it for reasons of their own. They don't want to pay out large amounts of indemnities and stuff. I'm sure it's a financial thing for them, but they won't accept it. But it's a fact that it happened. It's not a big mystery. And it's interesting that both these genocides happened in the middle of wars. The Armenian one in the middle of the First World War, and the Judeo-side in the middle of the Second World War. That's the time these events happen. And the third thing, which you could characterize as a genocide, is what happened in Rwanda. That too in the middle of a brutal civil war. Apart from these three events, I would be very reluctant to refer to acts taking out as genocide. Genocide is for me, is the systematic wiping out of a particular section, group, ethnic minority, majority of the population. So I am not in favor of what is very common today in human rights discourse, of saying everything's a genocide. 3,000 Kosovans are killed after NATO begins to drop its bomb, and that becomes a genocide. So, it debases the concept. So I'm careful on how I use it. Okay, can we have... Look, there's
I'd like to play devil's advocate.
I can't hear you because you're not speaking into the mic.
I would like to play a little bit the devil's advocate. Thank God for Michael Moore in our media. He still exists, and he has not been as punished as Salman Rushdie has been punished by the Arab media or the Iran media. I would like to know, Al Jazeera and the Palestinian newspapers, do they talk very much about the bombings and the suicide bombings?
Well, Al Jazeera certainly does, yeah.
Yes, but how do they comment about it? That's the point.
Look, they report them, and they have Israeli official spokesmen talking about them. They certainly do that. But whereas here, when you talk about them, it's totally decontextualized. And it again was an Israeli politician, Abraham Bernberg, who 4 years ago wrote an open letter in an Israeli paper and said, I know suicide bombing is bad, but if we had been reduced to the conditions to which we have reduced the Palestinians, perhaps we would have done the same. And now I'm not going to carry on because there are 5 more people behind you, and I have talked about this subject at great length, okay?
I have a question which has troubled me increasingly these last few months. There is a considerable amount of